So just really, really briefly, because unfortunately we're running slightly behind schedule. I'm very, very excited to have Vikki Boliver here. When I wrote an email to her and she said yes to this. I'm super excited that she's going to talk at this event. I think it's absolutely amazing to meet someone who is incredibly generous with their time, very, very supportive, especially with early career researchers, and whose research is so exciting. So I thought I'd just quickly reel off a couple of things she's done before. So she did a sociology BA at Leicester, she did an MPhil at Cambridge and a doctorate at Oxford. She's been a lecturer in numerous different institutions such as Oxford, Harvard as a visiting lecturer, as well as Bath Spa, and she arrived at Durham in 2011. She recently was appointed as a professor. Yeah. Congratulations. And her work concentrates on social inequalities, especially in terms of the access to AG, as well as patterns of social mobility across generations. And look up her work on contextual admissions, because it's making a bit of stir across the sector, I think, on free school meals. It's very, very exciting. She's been followed around by UCAS several times on several occasions because her work, I don't think there's anyone here now, I'm not quite sure. Her work on fairness of access has been kind of refuted by them, should we put it that way? Her most recent work has been concentrating on destinations of BME students, and her work generally looks at clustering within AG and inequalities across the board. I'll hand over to her.
Great, thank you, Rita. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be at this launch and able to speak to you. I've been reading all the outputs from the Sheffield Student project. Absolutely fascinating. The talks today were fascinating as well. It's a really amazing project with really valuable results and publications. We're going to get wine at 5 o'clock, so I'm going to be definitely finished before then. Rita asked me to talk about inequalities within the broader student life cycle, and some of what I'm going to say is very inspired by the Sheffield Student project. We're very much on the same page about what are the kinds of things that universities what can we do, what should we do to actually even out those inequalities as students progress through higher education. I'm going to start at the very beginning with thinking about issues of access to university in the first place, because when we're thinking about evening up inequalities while students are at universities, we've always got to be mindful of the fact that the composition of the universities, particularly high tariff universities like this one and my own, are very particular places, as Thomas mentioned, that they continue to be for very socially advantaged students by and large. They continue to be often not very ethnically diverse institutions, and this is despite the fact that for decades now, widening participation has been high on the policy agenda. And despite the fact that we're spending millions every year trying to widen participation, things haven't changed very much. So that green line at the very bottom is the percentage of 15-year-olds who were on free school meals at 15, who progressed to a higher tariff university. It's kind of increased a little bit in the course of a decade, not very much at all, and only really in line with the general increase in the proportions of students going on to university. So the gap in progression, particularly to high tariff universities, has remained. The composition of universities like this one and like my own hasn't really changed very much with respect to social background. Sometimes a similar picture, depending on the institution you're talking about, with respect to ethnicity. Again, if you look at access to higher tariff institutions, Black students in particular are notable by their absence in higher tariff universities, some more so than others. So the inequalities that are part of the student experience are partly shaped by the composition of the student body and what it means to be a student at particularly at high tariff universities. We know as well from the quantitative evidence on outcomes that student retention, progression and achievement in higher education is very much shaped by social background. This is work from Claire Crawford, where she's created a socioeconomic index ranking students from the least deprived end of the spectrum through to the most deprived and calculating how the degree of a student's deprivation relates to things like still being on their course of higher education 2 years after starting. What she shows is that if you're at the most advantaged end of the spectrum, fewer than 10% of such students drop out within the first 2 years, compared to more than 20% of those at the most disadvantaged end of the spectrum. Similar pattern when you think about the percentage who can actually go all the way and complete within 5 years. The most advantaged students, more than 80%, complete their degrees within 5 years, compared to just 60% of those who are the most disadvantaged. And the degree classifications, as we know, also vary depending on social background. So of those who graduate, the most socioeconomically advantaged students, 70% of those come out with a first or a 2-1, compared to just 40% of those from the most deprived backgrounds. So huge disparities in getting a degree and the nature of that degree. Similar pattern, I guess, more almost as pronounced really in relation to ethnicity. So it's still the case, as it has been for a long time, that there is a huge difference between the degree classifications that white British students come out with and those that black and Asian British students come out with. So getting a first or a 2-1, it will be the case for around 70% of white students, compared to less than 60% of those from BME backgrounds. So we have inequalities in access, we have inequalities in the key markers of outcomes whilst at university. And to pick up on a slide that Tom presented that I think is extremely important and extremely illuminating, it's not just these hard metrics of the CV-related components of a student's experience in higher education that matter. What really matters is what's going on during that time at university. And I think one of the particularly compelling findings of the Sheffield Student project is just how different the kind of traditional high-tariff university-going student is from those from widening participation, non-traditional backgrounds. So absolutely astounding differences in terms of capacity to pay for tuition fees up front and therefore not be saddled with, even if it's just an emotional saddling with debts as a result of fees, not being saddled with the interest that's accruing on those debts as well, which is has psychological ramifications as well as practical ones. Massive differences that this project has observed in terms of the degree to which parents can help with things like housing costs, with living expenses, with the wealthier students, having really nice existence, I guess, and great, but a real contrast to those whose parents can't afford to help them. By contrast, and Tom talked about this earlier, that a lot of disadvantaged students from families that can't afford to help financially are working long hours to the detriment of their studies and to the detriment of their social lives and their capacity to engage with extracurricular activities. And one thing that wasn't really emphasised in Tom's talk, but comes out really clear in the papers, is the kind of the bust periods that disadvantaged students face when at university. When finance, there are real periods where there's literally no money to meet the costs that are coming up, or the one-off cost that happens, or just the regular day-to-day costs. It's not a kind of smooth ride on the money that disadvantaged students have. It's very up and down, and that has huge ramifications for their time at university and their capacity to succeed. Well, I think we should also think as well about inclusion and belonging as an important aspect of how students from different backgrounds experience higher education. There's been quite a lot in the media about race and higher education and belonging. So not so long ago there was the I Too Am Oxford movement, that was challenging experiences of racism and discrimination in what is a very white and especially privileged university context. And you can point to studies that have similar things to say about social class, how people from working class backgrounds feel very alienated in high tariff universities, feel quite sidelined and marginalised, and in some cases even kind of belittled by their more affluent peers who have quite negative, make negative assumptions about them, have negative expectations about them just because of their social background. It's worth saying a little bit as well about what happens after university, because again these things are very socially stratified. So, going on to postgraduate study, it massively varies depending on whether you're from a very affluent family who used private schools during secondary schooling versus going to a state school. Very different depending on the educational background of parents as to whether you go on to postgraduate study afterwards. And big ethnic group differences with, again, the Black Caribbean students being the least likely to go and do postgraduate master's courses. Just one more metric, and then we'll get on to thinking about why these disparities are so large and so persistent. Just something that came out recently, last week I think it was, looking at the financial returns to a university degree depending on your social background, and how the earnings disparities are big the minute you step out the door of a university, and they only widen over time depending on whether you're from the most advantaged group, the independent school group, the red line there, whose salaries are really soaring away from even those in the most advantaged group of those who went to state schools. And the students that the Sheffield Student project followed are at the very bottom with a very flat earnings trajectory often on average. Okay. So if we think about disparities in student experience and the various ways in which we might think about reaping the benefits of higher education, I think it's useful to think about all of the ingredients that add up to what it means to be a student as a kind of like a Jenga game. So that in theory there's this beautifully solid block that has no holes in it, it's perfectly held up, very solid foundations. And what you tend to see for students from non-traditional backgrounds is that, like in a Jenga game, little bits and pieces are being pulled away from that solid tower as time goes by. Sometimes just one or two things. Sometimes these things get slotted back in and then they get pulled out again. So sometimes all of these things, all of these blocks have been pulled out of this otherwise steady tower at the same time. And unsurprisingly, things start to wobble, right? So I want to talk briefly about 5 elements or 5 supporting structures, I guess, if you like, that really singly and certainly together make a massive difference in the capacity of non-traditional students to have the benefits of higher education that are expected and typically enjoyed by traditional students. So if we start with 2 related blocks, which are learning support and inclusive pedagogy, I think we always have to recognise that if we want to ensure that widening participation route students benefit as much as they possibly can and ought to from a higher education, that we need to take a different approach to teaching and learning than perhaps has been traditional in universities in the past, and particularly in universities like this one and like my own. It's not enough to give people a reading list and tell them to go to the library for 3 years and come back and sit a finals exam. We need to actually teach people, don't we? And we're often going to need to and should be happy to bridge the gaps in knowledge that students have whose educations to date haven't given them all the preparatory knowledge that they need to hit the ground running once at university, or hasn't given them all the study skills and all the knowledge about how to write an essay and how to find books in the library and how to reference using the Harvard style. You know, these things are learnt, and we should be prepared as a university to be teaching those to all of our students, but particularly bearing in mind that there are some students who won't have had these things laid on for them in their previous schooling. I think we need to do more as well in the way of formative feedback, right? It's still kind of like a new thing in universities, unfortunately. For formative essay, we're so proud that we have formative essays, and it's like one thing just before Christmas, and that's it. We need to do a lot more formative assessment for students so they know, am I getting this? Where am I going wrong? What are you going to pull me up on in the summer when I submit the thing that counts towards my degree? We need to do a lot more formative work with our students if we're going to enable them to show what they're able to do. And I think really important, and I bang on about this at my home institution all the time because we really don't do this, is keeping track of people, right? Not letting us realise that students are not surviving academically or otherwise simply because they don't turn up in year 2. They're not there when the following October starts. We need to keep an eye on students so that we can intervene in a timely manner to help them stay on track, help them solve the problems that they might be facing. A related aspect is inclusive pedagogy. Again, not something that in high tariff universities we're that used to doing or that familiar with or that comfortable with, but I think it's something that we absolutely need to do if we're going to meet the needs and support the potential of non-traditional students. So we need to think about our curriculum. Is it accessible? Is it relatable? Does it mean something to students? We need to think about the way that we deliver our teaching and learning sessions. It's not a case of I'm going to simply tell you what I know and then you make of it what you will and fill in the gaps in the library and come back with your 2,000 word essay next Monday. It's got to be thinking about how am I going to best communicate these ideas to the students, how am I going to check their understanding, how are they going to get to have a say and put their perspective into the pot. Really has to be very student-centred. Fair assessment is really critical as well. I think we don't really think these three things through very well. We're often assessing students from non-traditional backgrounds on things that we haven't taught them about or we haven't taught them how to do. We ask them to write essays, to write critically reflective pieces, to go do a book review, to go do some independent research, and we've not shown them what even that is, and we only summatively tell them, oh, that's not what I meant, you did that wrong. Right? We can't do that. We need to feedback students supportively. There are some academics who just get annoyed with students who don't instantly get stuff and couldn't walk out of the door on day one with a 2-1. We need to be supportive in our feedback to students, and we need to promote a collegial culture of collaborative learning, joint enterprise thinking, a place where we can expose our ignorance and learn from one another and not be held to account in those learning settings or not be judged comparatively to others. On the other side of the Jenga tower are the things that have been talked about very much today and are really critical. So financial support and how that is intimately linked with the capacity of students to be students on a full-time, ongoing, in-depth basis. So if students are supposed to be studying full-time, they need to be able to study full-time, right? They need to have the resources that enable them to do that. We're very tolerant of the need for part-time work. I feel that we shouldn't be tolerant of it at all, not in the sense that we should tell students they're naughty and wrong for doing part-time work. What I mean is we accept that it's inevitable that students have to work part-time. But if you think about it, why do we accept that? Why do we accept that it's inevitable that students have to work during term time? They're supposed to be full-time students and they need the financial resources that will allow them to do that. They need to be free from money worries when they're trying to study, right? The psychological impact of not having enough money let alone the debt that's going to follow people around for 30 years, is huge. These things have been touched upon and are very important findings of the Sheffield Student project, that money to do stuff beyond the minimum, beyond simply coming to lectures and then going home again. You need money for books. I bought 2 books when I was an undergraduate, and I still don't have very many books, because to me books are like expensive things to buy. I'm a kind of library girl. But students need to buy books, they need to buy resources, they need to be able to go on field trips. And if your budget is tight, you cannot do that. You need to be able to socialise, you need to be able to join clubs, and often these things are pretty expensive, right? If you're living on a shoestring, you just can't get involved in those things. And we should give students the option of the residential experience, right? It's not for everybody, not everybody wants to live in halls, but some do and are not able to, and that is problematic if that's due to financial pressures not making that possible. I think this one is important too, that time off, not working 40 hours a week every vacation period. I used to work for the employment agency per temps. I don't know whether that is a Midlands thing or even still exists. Does it still exist, per temps? And as soon as I'd finished term, I was straight down to per temps to get my job, because I needed that money to survive. And I did that every vacation, and sometimes in term time as well, throughout my degree, to scrape by. I didn't get any real time to meditate on what I just learned that academic year. I didn't get time to read sideways around my discipline, and I really feel the loss of that, and that was down to finances. Okay. So any one of these blocks, pull it out and things are going to wobble. For many students, these blocks are all coming out at the same time. And I've put sense of belonging in the middle, because I think that actually the 4 blocks on the outside are all related to sense of belonging. So if you're not supported in your learning, if there's not an inclusive approach to teaching, if there's not adequate finances, if you're not able to be a student, how are you going to feel like you belong in this institution and are meant to be a student and are meant to succeed as a student? And I want to return to actually where I started, pursuing this idea about sense of belonging as being critically important, because it comes back partly to representation, doesn't it? Feeling a sense of belonging is not just about having enough money to do what all the other people are doing, but it's about looking around and thinking, oh, this is a place where people like me go. Yeah, not everyone's like me, but there are plenty of people who are like me, as well as plenty of people who are very different from me as well. And it's still a really important barrier, I think, to equitable student experiences for different social groups, that these institutions that we're talking about, the high tariff institutions, are still so socially and ethnically elite. I just give some illustrative figures for the Russell Group as compared to the national picture, Sheffield as well. I put Durham up there so you can see that we're even worse than you guys. You guys do quite well on state schools, but I can imagine what state schools we're talking about.
It's geography.
Yeah.
There's no.
It looks good, but it ain't, is it? Because you can tell that by looking at the class background, at the low participation neighbourhood rates. These are Sheffield and Durham are just as bad as each other, basically, at the end of the day. And when Rita introduced me, she said that one of the things that I'm really passionate about right now is contextualised admissions. And that's largely because what we have to recognise is that universities like Sheffield and Durham are not going to become more diverse and not going to become more representative and give widening participation students a sense of, I belong here, people like me come here, because we exclude people without question by setting our entry requirements so high. So these are students who graduated from a UK university in 2010, so the data is slightly old, but the pattern is basically the same now. And these are the A-levels that they came in with, right? If we say that our institution is a AAA institution, then 25% of university goers from social class 1 are eligible to come here, but only about 4% of people from the lowest social class, from routine manual occupation parents. we have to actually move quite a long way down the grade boundaries to get to 25% of working class people are going to be eligible to come here if it's AAA, or 40% are going to be eligible to come here if it's generally an AAB institution. So we're going to have to look at our entry requirements for disadvantaged students, recognising the massive barriers that they faced to even get any A levels at all in many cases, right? And I think one reason that universities are a bit reluctant to reduce their entry requirements is because, well, partly it's league tables, let's be fair, league tables is a big part of it, right? But it's also because they've begun to think that you need 3 A's to get a Sheffield degree, to get a Durham degree, you know, and if we let anybody in with any less than that, they're just going to fall flat on their faces. But when you look at the relationship between grades on entry and outcomes, this is for Russell Group universities specifically, what you see is actually it's a very gradual decline. As your grades on entry get lower, your chances of getting a first or a 2-1 from a Russell Group university, they don't fall off a cliff. They slowly decline, such that if you lower your entry requirements to 3 C's even, there's still a 50-50 chance that that individual will get a first or a 2-1. And this would be in the context of little help in getting that first or 2-1. Just imagine how high the success rate could be if we actually taught our students and supported them to learn. You know, I'm thinking it could be rather more than 50%. Okay. So wine is not far away, so let me just summarise what I think is the way forward in equalising the student experience and what it means to have gone to university and to have benefited from university education. And much of it chimes with what Tom and Rita are arguing for. So I think more equitable representation is really critical to equalise student experience, and I think we're only going to get there if we take a contextual approach to admissions and if we reduce entry requirements for disadvantaged learners in recognition that they have loads of potential and that we can nurture that potential and they can do really well in these great institutions with great academics and great resources, right? We absolutely need to support learning to realise potential, and we absolutely need to take an approach to teaching and learning that respects, values, makes use of in a positive way the different identities and experiences that people bring to the table. It's not actually very helpful to be a homogenous body with entirely privileged existences for the whole of our lives. You know, different experiences are really valuable. We really need more money for students to enable them to be students. And I think it's actually really important to say that we also need more units like the one you guys have here, which I think is extremely rare in the sector. Hardly any UK universities have embedded research units that are looking at issues of widening participation, that are funded by the institution rather than having to go out there and get grants externally, and if you don't, that's it, we close your unit down. So I think it's absolutely fantastic that you have this unit here, and very much think that your researchers are leading the way. And I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.